Greetings. I'd like to take a few minutes here to discuss comparative analysis of genocides. And within this presentation, I'm only going to present a few ideas about comparative analysis of genocides that I don't want you to think that these are the only strategies or techniques to use. I'm just trying to give you some ideas about different strategies, but you can read some of the literature and look at how comparative analysis has taken place in some of your textbooks, in some of the readings. And I also put an article I wrote on comparing the Rwandan and Bosnian genocides. First, I want you to think about where you're going to obtain your data for your comparative analysis. And of course, you can use multiple sources, sometimes surveys or historical documents. Sometimes we're able to obtain government records, other times case studies, observations. We can also analyze newspapers and radio and television broadcasts. So there's multiple sources where we can obtain our information. One of the ways to organize a comparative analysis is to look at existing models that have worked well. And Jacques Semelin in 2007 published a comparative analysis of genocides, or I'm sorry, I should say massacres, and a really excellent book, Purify and Destroy, the Political Uses of Massacre and Genocide. And in the appendix, Professor Semlin discusses investigating a massacre, and he asks these questions that are really relevant for our purposes. For example, he asks, who applies the social control, or who is attempting, which group is out there trying to dominate, trying to take full control of the society. And then who are the targeted victims? There may be various victim groups, or there may be one major one. And how are the enemy and threat constructed? In other words, that the genocidal perpetrators construct an enemy and a threat and put that together in a way that is presented to others in order to support the genocidal behavior. What is the mode of operation? How do they carry out the genocide? If you look at comparative analysis, for example, you could look at a variety of factors related to geography or weapon use. What is the time frame of the genocide? And what are the political and the media effects? And what are the aftermath narratives? What I have done in my studies on comparative genocide, I have two major studies out there where in one I compare the Bosnian and also we compare the Bosnian and the Rwandan genocides. So we do a comparative analysis, and what we did in this study is we took earlier studies we had conducted on the Rwandan genocide and on the Bosnian genocide, and then we started putting them together to see if a particular theory worked to explain the similarities and differences between these genocides. Recently, I put together a study using the same theory, looking at sex crimes during genocides. The first study incorporated some of my previous research from the Bosnian and Rwandan genocides, and then more recently I added the Holocaust. And specifically, I looked at the different types of sex crimes that were carried out and who the perpetrators were and how they went about their criminal violent behavior. And there were differences as well as similarities. So really you have to think about what genocides do you want to compare, and what is it about those genocides that you want to compare and contrast, really. Huttenbach, in a brief article conducting a comparative study of genocide, found in the edited book by Dr. Toten, Teaching About Genocide Issues, Approaches, and Resources, talks about this whole idea of doing comparative analysis, of first selecting a central theme and then comparing and contrast the two cases and focusing on, for example, several areas. And you can choose particular areas. I almost think the more specific the area, the better. If you go into an area of just general themes that are all over the place, really you're going to have a very general paper, or you're going to have to write a book. And I don't think you want to do either of those at this particular point, at least for the assignment. So Huttenbach talks about the preconditions, the factors that led up to the genocide or the emergence of the crisis, and then also propaganda campaigns. Also discussed as the genocidal event, the perpetrators, the victims, the collaborators, the resistors, and there's been whole books written about resistors or collaborators or victims or perpetrators or a combination of those. And then finally, the post-genocide event, that what were the international reactions or international interventions, if there were any? And what about trials? Were there trials, and how did those trials play out? How was the society reconstructed after? And so all of those basically that I just mentioned, you could conduct a comparative analysis paper on any of those variables, really. So I think that's helpful to begin to take a look at thinking about comparisons. And what I would like to also mention is that in the book Centuries of Genocide, edited by Samuel Toten and Parsons, that they have put together excellent comparative analysis by looking at all these various dimensions of genocides. And what they've done is they've gone ahead and put it together in such a format that we're able to really take a close look at several themes. And so let me briefly discuss some of those themes. I'm finding those on the PowerPoint here. So, okay. They ask, for example, who committed the genocide? And again, there's some overlap with Semlin's work. Who committed the genocide? How was it committed? Why was it committed? Who was involved? All of those are also some of the same variables that Semlin recommended. What were the historical forces and trends? What was the long-term impact? Huttenbach mentioned both of those as well. What were the responses by others? Is there agreement or disagreement among scholars regarding the nature of the genocide? And how do people make sense of the genocide today, or do they even discuss it today? And what does the study of this specific genocide contribute to the field of genocide studies? And so those are some more questions. Really, my goal of this brief video was to kind of get you to think about some of the different features. And I have posted a paper that I wrote comparing the Bosnian and the Rwandan genocides, and you can read through that just to get an example. And I'll put some other papers and suggested readings online as well, so you can see some other research that's been conducted. You can see in my own research, I compare also to perpetrators from the Bosnian genocide. And I find that there's a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences between the two. And in fact, I think I find more differences overall when we start putting everything together. And I was probably looking for those differences. So this is just a brief overview of comparative analysis, and I think really what's helpful is reading models that already exist and papers that have already been published on comparative analysis of genocides to get some ideas. But again, I think really my tip would be to stay very specific on a central theme of interest to yourself. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.